Welcome to Beat Diabetes. We're going to get away from the comments and the questions and go back to a book review of sorts. Obviously, with these book reviews, as I call them, I can't really get into a lot of detail in the short amount of time that I take on these videos, but I think the nuggets you can find in some of these books is invaluable. And so this one is The Diabetes Diet by Dr. Richard Bernstein. I am a fanboy of Dr. Richard Bernstein. He played a major role in my own victory, even though I've never met the man, but I have sure appreciated him and his books. And this book, The Diabetes Diet, it's about half recipes. And I'm never a big fan of diabetic recipes, not because I've really got anything against them, but most of them I find are too exotic. They call for too many ingredients. They take too much time to make, and I'm a simple guy. Don't give me exotic recipes. So I never paid much attention to the second half of the book, of this book, but in the first half, there's a lot of gems. And so I just wanted to share a couple of quotes for this episode of Beat Diabetes. We'll start with the introduction. And he says, how I discovered the low carbohydrate diet and saved my own life. That's powerful. And that's one of the things I like about Dr. Bernstein. He doesn't mince words. You know, one of the things I've noticed with a lot of doctors that are sort of a little bit okay with cutting the carbs, but they can't for the life of them admit that carbohydrates are a major problem for diabetics, and the overdosing of carbohydrates is a major problem for everybody. Every single person that is eating too many carbs is in trouble. And so they'll throw out things like, well, you know, carbs are different. Some are better than others. And then some carbs have they're low glycemic, and we're all different anyway. And so some of us can tolerate carbs more than others. And they throw out one caveat after another, until by the time they get done, you realize they don't want to admit carbs are a big problem at all. It almost pains them. It's almost painful for them to declare, diabetic, you'd better watch those carbohydrates. Now, that's never been my problem, and it is definitely not Dr. Bernstein's problem. So what he says is, I discovered the low carbohydrate diet. I saved my life. And boy, he sure did. And in fact, he talks about how that when he got diagnosed as a type 1 diabetic, the average age lifespan for a type 1 in those days, which was back in 1946, was 30. If you made it to 30 or a little beyond, you were doing pretty well. Folks, Dr. Richard Bernstein is still practicing medicine as far as I know. He's 90 years old. 90. He outlived the average lifespan of a type 1 diabetic at the time he was diagnosed by 60 years. You figure maybe he did a few things right? I think so. So let's get on with a couple of the quotes. Won't take too long today, but he says, when I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in 1946, the life expectancy was, as mentioned, 30 years. He says, my death would not have come from diabetes per se. I'm pretty certain I would have died of kidney failure. Major issue for diabetics is kidney failure. He says, a direct result of the low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet from the American Diabetes Association that I followed for 24 years after my diagnosis. So when he was diagnosed, I think he was around 12 years old as a type 1. And for the next 24 years, he followed that low-fat, high-carb diet that was popular and that the ADA pushed for years and years, and he got worse and worse and worse and worse. And he says, I would have died of kidney failure had I not discovered that I had to cut my carbohydrates significantly. And he mentions some of the issues he had. He says that by the time he was an adult and married and with children, he said, my body was like an old man. Now, he was a young man. He was in his, I guess, 20s at that time. He said, I had excruciatingly painful kidney stones, a stone in the salivary duct, stones in my gallbladder, frozen shoulders. My feet had become progressively deformed. They had begun to lose sensation from peripheral neuropathy. And he says, after a routine exercise stress test, I was told my heart had been damaged, scar tissue had replaced muscle tissue, a common cause of heart failure and death. He was a mess. And I've heard him on some of his videos on YouTube where he describes other things still. So that's just a partial list. He was an absolute wreck. And he came to believe, and he believes to this day, that the reason behind all these problems was high glucose levels. And he tells his story. I won't go into detail today, but he tells how that he finally was able to get what we would look at as a very, very primitive blood sugar meter. It weighed about 3 pounds. And his wife had to sign for it. She was a medical doctor, so she signed for it. They wouldn't give it to a normal person. He was an engineer at the time. He was not a doctor. And for 3 years of testing his blood sugar, he observed what was going on, and he noticed usually a couple of times a day, his glucose levels would be over 400 or around 400. And then they would also be down as low as, 60 or 40, whatever it was. They would go high, very, very high and very, very low. He observed it for 3 years, but didn't quite know what to do about it. He just noticed, boy, I've got problems. I've got all this plummeting and rising, surging and dropping of my glucose. But what do I do? There was no one to tell him. Had he been able to, the 90-year-old Dr. Bernstein, been able to get into a time machine and go back and talk to the 20-some-year-old Dr. Bernstein, well, he wasn't a doctor in those days, but talk to 20-some-year-old Richard Bernstein, he could have told him the whole thing and fixed his problem in a matter of a few days. But there was no older Richard Bernstein to come in a time machine and tell him that. So he watched his blood sugar going up and down and up and down, up to 400, way down into the 60s, 50s, 40s, bouncing all over the place because he was taking insulin as a type 1 diabetic would. But he had no idea why he was so inconsistent with his glucose. Now, here's something to keep in mind. Some people, they don't want to hear about high glucose. Their idea is, well, the problem is high insulin, and so high glucose hardly matters at all. Well, high glucose does matter. As a type 1, his problem was not that his pancreas was overproducing insulin. His pancreas was producing zero insulin, none at all. Of course, he was taking insulin. But his problem was high glucose, and then, of course, there were times he probably did give himself too much insulin, but it was both. But the high glucose will do you in. Don't just assume that high insulin is the only problem. There are two problems for most type 2 diabetics, and they are high glucose and high insulin. So he had all kinds of problems. And he says, during these 3 years where he was just watching it, he was testing, he was watching, but he hadn't put together what was causing the high glucose and the low glucose. So he says, I was eating the same food, taking the same medication for my symptoms, not connecting the dots between the foods I ate and my blood sugar roller coaster. So he's like, the light bulb had not yet come on that there was a connection between these huge surges of glucose and the food I ate. He would figure that out, but it took him a while. So for years, he's just watching it go up and go down, go up and go down, plotting it out, noticing his patterns, but having no idea what to do about them. Until finally he did a search. And nowadays we do searches on Google, but in those days you go to the library and you check out their microfilm section and so forth, their card catalog of periodicals. So he did a search trying to figure out how he could maybe help himself. His first thought was, maybe exercise will be the victory. Let me see if there have been some studies done where exercise brought victory over diabetic runaway blood sugar. And he couldn't find any. Exercise, there were just no strong evidences that exercise would fix him. But what he did find, as he looked at all these different studies, was there was evidence that when they were able to normalize blood sugar in animals like rats and mice and other animals, their symptoms would go away. and they would lose all the diabetic symptoms. Maybe they were still diabetic, but the symptoms would be gone after a while if they could just normalize the blood sugar instead of bouncing all over the place. He thought, that's interesting. Normalize blood sugar. Wonder how you would even do that. He went to his own doctor, and he showed him some of these studies and said, looks to me like if I can just find a way to normalize my blood sugar, I might be able to be free from all these diabetic symptoms, like the stones and the arthritis and all the problems he was having, the frozen shoulders and all of these things. His heart was getting weaker. His kidneys were failing. He's like, well, maybe if I could just find a way to normalize my blood sugar, I could be free from that. His doctor almost laughed at him and just told him, my friend, you're not an animal. Maybe it works with rats, not going to work with people. But Dr. Bernstein has a personal characteristic in his personality that has really helped him a great deal. He's a stubborn guy. And when he had read these articles about how animals could lose their problems, their diabetic complications, by normalizing their blood sugar, in other words, getting your blood sugar about the way a normal person's blood sugar would be. When he saw that, he's like, I've got to find a way. Now, I'm not going to take the time today and go into all the details of that, but obviously what he found was it all has to do with carbohydrates. Let me say it again. I've said it twice. He starts his book out, the introduction, with these words, How I Discovered the Low Carbohydrate Diet and Saved My Own Life. I can say the same thing. Mine was not type 1. I didn't have all the symptoms he had. But diabetes was coming at me like a freight train. And it was actually Dr. Bernstein plus a little fellow named Mike the glucose meter, where I tested myself over and over again. In some ways, he and I are kind of similar. We both found some things out by fanatical blood sugar testing. And what he discovered was those huge surging highs. And even the plummeting low glucose, which is terrible. You get hypoglycemic reactions and you feel terrible. You pass out maybe. He said all of that, he found out that all of that could be basically resolved if he stopped eating so many carbohydrates, potatoes, rice, sugary foods, desserts, sodas. If he just stopped the carbohydrates and brought them down to a reasonable level, and basically for him it meant about 12 grams of carbs per meal. And suddenly it all calmed down. He discovered, let me say it one last time, the low carbohydrate diet and saved his own life. Benedict and I do have another YouTube channel besides Beat Diabetes. I'm talking about our Bible teaching channel. On this channel, we usually have 3 different types of Bible studies posted every week. On Mondays, I do a video devotional, which is a short talk about various Bible topics, normally lasting about 8 minutes. On Thursdays, you can see Benedict and me sitting around our dining room table studying the Bible together. And usually, a couple of other days in the week, we post audio podcasts. There's no video connected with these. They are strictly audio only, which means you can listen to them as you go for a walk, drive in your car, or prepare your meals. There's nothing to look at, but plenty to hear. So check out our Bible YouTube channel, which goes by my name, Dennis Pollock. A link to this channel is in the description.